Good morning, church leaders. I hope you're planning on a big day today. I wanted to share a brief teaching with you this morning that you may be able to receive some encouragement from. Genesis chapter 2, very familiar chapter. It's a powerful chapter, and frankly, if I really began to dive into it, we would be here all day. And we don't have that luxury this morning, and so I'm just going to hit the high points. Uh, Genesis chapter 32, I'll begin reading in verse 1. It reads this way. So Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. And when Jacob saw them, he said, "This is God's camp." And he called the name of that place Mahanaim, Mahanaim, I believe it's pronounced. Then Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau, his brother, in the land of Seir, country of Edom, and he commanded them, saying, "Speak thus to my lord Esau. Thus your servant Jacob says, I have dwelt with Laban and stayed there until now. I have oxen, donkeys, flocks, and male and female servants, and I have sent to tell my lord that I might find favor in your sight." And when the messengers returned to Jacob, then the messengers returned to Jacob, saying, "We came to your brother Esau, and he also is coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him." And this set into motion a great deal of turmoil in Jacob's life. Now, keep in mind, Jacob is pursuing the calling of God on his life. He's following the instructions that God gave him to return to the land from which he came. He is only doing this out of obedience, and just as you and I perform our callings out of obedience as well. Find it interesting that the calling came first, the resources came later. It was after Jacob was already on his way that the resources were allocated and the angels showed up. Anytime you're operating in the perfect will of God for your life, I'm telling you that you will always have the resources that you need. I've told this story before, I'll tell it again. I served on staff at a particular church. He's a great pastor, but this pastor's gifting was not in the area of administration, and I was helping him out with the administrative side of his ministry. And so he called this meeting one day, and money was tight. And he called a meeting, and he had all of the staff and all of the board there, and he spent a few minutes telling us how he was going to have to go to the bank and ask for a payment holiday to tell them that they were not going to be able to make the payment for about 3 months because the funds were not there. And so they were going to go and ask this of the bank. And so I let him do and say what needed to be said. And so finally, at the end of his speech, he looked at the table. He says, "Does anybody have anything to add?" And so I looked around the table and waited for anybody else to speak up, and everybody pretty much was in agreement with him because things were tight. I will tell you, things were tight. And so I said, "Well, Pastor, I do have something that I want to bring forth." I said, "And I'm going to bring this out of my experience." I looked at the pastor and I said, "Pastor, I have to ask you a tough question. Are you in the perfect will of God for your life?" He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "You as serving as pastor of this church, are you in the center of God's perfect will for your life as senior pastor of this church?" He looked at me. He said, "Absolutely, yes. This is where I'm called to. I know beyond any shadow of a doubt I'm in the perfect will of God for my life right now." And I turned and I asked the same question of every one of the staff members. And every one of them said, "Yes, I'm in the perfect will of God for my life, serving where I'm serving now." Then I turned back to the pastor. I said, "Pastor, we have cut out all discretionary spending. I said, the only thing that we have in the church expenses this month that was discretionary was the fact that we bought coffee. So other than that, there was no discretionary spending that had taken place this month. I said, Pastor, here's what we're going to do. I said, when's the mortgage due? He said, 2 weeks. I said, well, I'll tell you what we'll do. I said, let's believe God that he's going to pay the mortgage in the next 2 weeks. He said, this is the slowest 2 weeks of the month. It's highly unlikely that's going to happen. I said, I'm willing to believe that God will provide what we have need of. I said, we have done everything that we can do. I do not want to go to the bank and tell the bank that my God failed me. And so I challenged them. I said, before we agree to do that, let's see these 2 weeks of offerings and let's believe God that God will pay for the mortgage. Well, over the the first Sunday was slim, as we would very well have expected it to be, because God does everything at last minute to test our faith. But the second week, we received the offering, and it was enough to pay the mortgage and then some, which was highly unusual for that time of the month. But God paid the mortgage. And I told the pastor, I said, look, if God doesn't pay the mortgage, I'll go with you to the bank and tell them our God failed us. I said, but I have no plans on going to the bank. I said, so put it in your little book there. In the minutes of this meeting, Gary Doherty said, no, I don't believe that we need a payment holiday. God will provide our needs. And he did. He did flawlessly. When I left the church many months later, and God was through with me there. When I left the church, he actually wrote me a letter of recommendation that said that the church would not have been there had I not served in the capacity that I did for the period of time that I did. But anytime God calls you somewhere and you're in the perfect will of God for your life and you're following the instructions that the Lord has given you, he will always provide the resources. And that's what he did in Jacob's case. He provided angels on the way to pave the way for where he was going. Now, Jacob, I like the way that the Bible says in verse 2, it says, when Jacob saw them. You and I don't often get to see what God is doing in our behalf when God is providing for our ministries. We typically don't find out about it until very last minute. For instance, in that church I was serving, it was the very last offering. I don't know what God had to do in order to create that size of an offering for that week. Who knows what he was doing in people's lives? There was no way for me to know that. All I knew was that the offering was there when we needed it. But God could have been setting that up for weeks. You really don't know what God is doing in your behalf a lot of times until the very last minute. And so we know that Jacob sent the messengers, and the messengers come back and said there were 400 men with Esau that were coming. It's very interesting that um, the scriptures say in verse 7 Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed, so much so that he divided the people that were with him and the flocks and the herds and the camels into two companies. He split them up. That way, if there was a great massacre, half of them could get away and it wouldn't be a total loss. Um, uh, he was planning for the worst because he was dealing with the stress of not knowing how God was going to provide. Now, if I had met angels on the way, I think I could have believed God for some great things. But he was greatly distressed because he knew his past and it wasn't a good one. Um, moving on toward the end of the chapter, the Bible says, and I'm I'm having to read over here, so bear with me. Um, the Bible says that in verse 22, and he arose that night and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed over the ford of Jabbok. He took them, sent them over the brook, and sent over what he had. And Jacob was left alone. And that's where a lot of people are in their ministries. Loneliness is a big thing for people who are serving the Lord. But sometimes you just don't have anybody you can talk to. You don't have anyone that you can trust. You're confide in. And Jacob had gotten to a place in pursuing his calling that he no longer had his things, he no longer had his relationships. He was there all alone with him and all of the things that were going on in his mind. It was a difficult time for him. There's a lot of ministers that are in that same boat this morning. They feel like they don't have anything, they don't have anybody they can trust, and they've got a lot going on in their mind. In Jacob's particular case, God shows up and he has the opportunity to wrestle with God. But I want to speak to those this morning that you lack your possessions that you feel like you need. You lack relationships that you feel like you deserve, and you lack the assurance that you're gonna prosper, you're gonna survive this thing that God has called you to. And I want to assure you that God will never call you to something that He's not going to provide for. He's called you on purpose. It wasn't a mistake. I heard a song a couple of years ago. I knew what I was getting into when I called you. And that was a powerful song for me at the time because I was wrestling with my calling at that particular moment as well. So I say this all to you this morning because I wanted to share with you some encouragement that God will provide in His timing, not our timing. It's never our timing. It's in His timing. When your faith is stretched, when there's nothing but you and God, that's when God does His best work. Let me encourage you, if you're in this boat, to find an opportunity to get along with God. One thing that I did early on in my ministry, and now being bivocational, I haven't had an opportunity to do this very often in recent years, but I used to take a week every year. I would, whether I would have a camper, I had somebody that would fund a cabin for me in the mountains, and I would go fast and I would pray, and I would really hear the heartbeat of God during that week. It was a time of spiritual refreshing. I encourage you to do that. Don't just go to a conference. Don't do anything that would create distraction. Find some alone time with God, just you and God. That might be on a beach, that might be in the mountains, that might be hiking the Appalachian Trail, whatever the case may be. Get alone with God and make sure that you hear from Him and that you are encouraged by Him. For because who knows, you may have angels that are in your path that you're unaware of. You may have people that are pursuing you that you think are out for your harm, and they're actually out for your good. You could be in a situation where your kids, your wives, your possessions are all a distraction from you actually experiencing the presence of God in your life. So I would encourage you to do that this morning. I know I've gone a little long this morning. God bless you this morning, and I hope you have a great day.